The crisp Saturday morning air was filled with the scent of pine and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. For years, this had been my sanctuary, a private retreat where I could escape the chaos of the world. My lakeside backyard was more than just a piece of property. It was the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and dreams. But as I stepped outside that morning, my heart sank. My once pristine backyard had been transformed into a chaotic parking lot. Expensive sedans, muddy off-road trucks, and haphazardly parked vehicles littered every inch of available space. My stomach churned with anger. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an invasion. The culprits? None other than the power-hungry Homeowners Association, HOA, led by their smug, self-righteous board members. For months, I had ignored their passive-aggressive notices and ridiculous demands, dismissing them as petty annoyances. But this was different. This was a blatant violation of my property rights, a deliberate attempt to assert control over what was mine. My blood boiled as I traced my steps around the mess of vehicles. Fresh dents marred the neatly arranged gravel. My outdoor furniture had been shoved aside, and tire marks desecrated the soft grass. To my utter disgust, someone had even tossed a crumpled fast food bag onto my patio. The nerve. My name is Ethan Carter, and I had worked tirelessly to build this life. My lakeside property wasn't just any home. It was my dream, my escape, my sanctuary. Yet here I stood, in the midst of an unauthorized parking lot, my space violated without so much as a warning. The HOA had always been a thorn in my side, with their unnecessary fines and absurdly strict rules. But this move, this complete disregard for my ownership, crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. I turned sharply toward the road, my fists clenched as I spotted two HOA board members, Gregory Hargrove and Linda Whitaker, chatting casually at the entrance of the neighborhood park across the street. Their laughter carried over the breeze, their postures relaxed, as if they had no idea, or worse, didn't care, about the chaos they had unleashed on my property. I could already imagine their excuse. It's for the community, they'd say, as if that justified their blatant trespassing. But I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a confrontation. No, I had something far better in mind. My phone was already in my hand, and within minutes, I had dialed the number of every towing company in the area. If my backyard was being treated as a free-for-all parking space, then it was time for these cars to disappear. By the time the sun set, my property was clear, and all I felt was the sweet, undeniable thrill of victory. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to take this humiliation lightly. If I had learned anything from dealing with them, it was that they always had another trick up their sleeve. This battle was won, but the war was just getting started. The retaliation begins. The very next morning, an official-looking notice was taped to my front door. Its bold red lettering practically screamed at me. The HOA, in all its self-righteous fury, had filed a formal complaint against me, accusing me of unauthorized towing of community vehicles. My jaw clenched as I read through the absurd claims. They were alleging that my lakeside backyard was part of a designated overflow parking area, a blatant lie with no legal backing. I knew every inch of my property lines and had reviewed the community guidelines more times than I cared to admit. Nowhere did it state that private land could be repurposed at the whim of an overreaching homeowners association. Yet here they were, twisting rules to suit their agenda, hoping to intimidate me into submission. If they thought a strongly worded notice was enough to make me back down, they had seriously underestimated me. I took a deep breath, forcing down the irritation bubbling inside me. This wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about control. The HOA had long operated on the assumption that residents would simply obey, too busy or indifferent to challenge their increasingly ludicrous demands. But I had no intention of playing into their hands. If they wanted a legal battle, I was more than ready. My first call was to my lawyer, Marcus Reynolds, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in property rights. Marcus wasted no time in tearing through their claims. His confidence was reassuring. The HOA had no legal right to dictate how I used my own backyard, and their attempt to classify it as a community lot was nothing short of fraudulent. A cease and desist letter was drafted and sent to the HOA board within hours. warning them in no uncertain terms that any further attempts to violate my property rights would be met with swift legal action. But the HOA wasn't done yet. Days later, they escalated their attack, slapping me with a series of fines, each more ridiculous than the last. Unapproved landscaping modifications for moving my own outdoor furniture back into place. Obstruction of community services for removing unauthorized vehicles. Failure to cooperate with HOA policies for refusing to acknowledge their fake parking designation. It was a full-fledged harassment campaign, a desperate attempt to strong-arm me into compliance through sheer financial exhaustion. Instead of feeling cornered, I only grew more determined. I meticulously documented every fine, every notice, and every instance of their overreach. I gathered testimonies from neighbors who had also been bullied into silence, homeowners who had been forced to comply with arbitrary rules just to avoid relentless penalties. Then, with Marcus's guidance, I filed a formal complaint against the HOA, not just with the Housing Authority, but with the State Attorney General's office. If they wanted to play dirty, I was more than prepared to bring the full weight of the law down on them. The HOA's downfall. It wasn't long before the cracks started to show. The HOA board members, who had laughed so freely at my expense, were suddenly scrambling to defend their actions. Their smug confidence was replaced by nervous backpedaling. Their fines had no legal standing. Their fabricated rules couldn't hold up under scrutiny. And worst of all for them, their fraudulent designation of my backyard as public property had opened them up to potential legal consequences far more severe than they had anticipated. What had started as their attempt to exert dominance had now transformed into a full-blown crisis, one they were utterly unprepared for. And yet, despite the clear shift in power, I knew this wasn't over. The HOA had been publicly embarrassed, their authority challenged in a way they had never experienced before. People like them didn't just slink away in defeat. They schemed, they retaliated, they found new ways to make life miserable for those who dared to oppose them. The first battle had been won, but as I watched an HOA representative storm away from my doorstep after delivering yet another useless notice, I had the unmistakable feeling that they were already planning their next move. The war was far from over, and whatever they had in store, I was ready. The final showdown. The HOA's next move came faster than I had anticipated, and it was more insidious than I could have imagined. I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery outside my home, the low rumble of an engine accompanied by the unmistakable screech of metal scraping against pavement. My stomach dropped as I rushed to the window, only to be met with a sight that sent my blood boiling. A construction crew was standing at the edge of my backyard, orange cones marking off a portion of my property as if it belonged to them. A hastily erected sign read, "Future Community Parking Expansion, authorized by HOA." It was absurd, a blatant attempt to rewrite reality, to erase the fact that my land was privately owned. The audacity was almost laughable, almost. But the implications were deadly serious. They weren't just harassing me anymore. They were attempting to take what was mine by force. I stormed outside, demanding an explanation, but the workers simply pointed me to a clipboard, an official-looking permit stamped at the top. My eyes scanned the document, looking for any indication that it was legitimate. And that's when I spotted it, the HOA signature, but no official city or county approval. It was a complete fabrication, a bold attempt to intimidate me into believing they had the power to do whatever they wanted. But they had made a fatal mistake. If they had gone through legal channels, they would have discovered what I already knew. My land was untouchable, and any attempt to alter it without my permission was trespassing, plain and simple. Without hesitation, I picked up my phone and called the police. I knew that arguing with the construction crew was pointless. They were just following orders, likely misled by the HOA's fabricated documents. But the law was on my side, and this time, I wasn't going to let the HOA wriggle out of the consequences. Within minutes, a squad car pulled up. The officers stepped out with no-nonsense expressions as they assessed the situation. I handed over the fraudulent permit, pointing out the obvious lack of official authorization, and watched as realization dawned on their faces. Trespassing, illegal construction, property damage. The violations stacked up like a house of cards, and the moment they turned their attention to the construction supervisor, the panic set in. The workers wasted no time packing up their equipment, hurried conversations breaking out as they scrambled to avoid being caught in the HOA's web of lies. But it was the arrival of an HOA board member, one of the same smug individuals who had watched my property be turned into a parking lot, that truly sealed the deal. He approached with an air of fake authority, attempting to justify the so-called project, but the officers weren't buying it. They hit him with a barrage of questions, their voices flat and unimpressed, and as he floundered for answers, it became increasingly clear that the HOA had no legal ground to stand on. I watched with quiet satisfaction as he was handed a formal citation, the beginnings of an investigation into their practices now officially underway. But even as the crew was forced to leave, even as the HOA's flimsy excuse for control was torn apart in broad daylight, I knew this was just another desperate move in their crumbling strategy. They had underestimated me at every turn, assuming I would cower under their pressure. But now, the tables had turned. My formal complaint was gaining traction, the exposure of their fraudulent tactics spreading through the community like wildfire. Homeowners who had once stayed silent out of fear were beginning to step forward, their own horror stories echoing my own. The once feared HOA was no longer an untouchable entity, but a group of corrupt individuals scrambling to hold on to power. And yet, deep down, I knew they weren't done. Their arrogance wouldn't allow them to admit defeat so easily, and if history had taught me anything, it was that they were capable of far worse. The police intervention had sent a message, but the real battle was still looming. They had been embarrassed, cornered, exposed, and when people like them were pushed into a corner, they didn't surrender. They retaliated. I had to be ready, because whatever came next, I knew it would be their most vicious attempt yet. The aftermath. The fallout from the HOA's vandalism was immediate and chaotic. The moment the news spread, the entire neighborhood erupted. Homeowners who had silently endured their overreach were finally speaking out, each with their own stories of bullying, intimidation, and ridiculous fines meant to keep them in line. What had once been whispered complaints behind closed doors were now being aired publicly, with furious residents demanding answers. The HOA board, once untouchable and smug in their authority, was now being backed into a corner, forced to explain their illegal actions. As the police investigation widened, their desperate attempts to downplay the situation only made things worse. Every excuse they gave crumbled under scrutiny. Every justification was contradicted by hard evidence. Their fabricated permits, their unauthorized use of private property, their blatant destruction of my fence, it was all coming back to haunt them. But even as their empire began to collapse, they still had one final act of desperation left. A week after the police formally charged multiple HOA board members with trespassing and property destruction, I received a letter, an official-looking document from the HOA's legal team, claiming that I had violated community trust and was now facing a forced compliance hearing. Their arrogance knew no bounds. Even after being exposed for illegal activity, even with criminal charges pending against them, they still had the audacity to act as if they were in control. But I wasn't intimidated. If anything, I welcomed it. I arrived at the so-called hearing, which was nothing more than a hastily arranged meeting at the community center meant to make it look like they still had authority. The remaining board members sat behind a long table, attempting to appear composed, but their nervous glances betrayed them. The room was packed, not just with HOA loyalists, but with furious homeowners who had come to witness the spectacle. The moment they attempted to speak, I shut them down. I didn't need to argue or plead my case. Instead, I did something far more effective. I handed out copies of the lawsuit I had just filed against them. Their faces went pale as they read through the legal documents, outlining every single violation they had committed: the trespassing, the vandalism, the fraudulent permits, the harassment. It was all there, in black and white, backed by undeniable evidence. But that wasn't even the worst part. As I stood before them, calmly explaining the consequences of their actions, I revealed the final nail in their coffin. Thanks to the police investigation, it had been discovered that the HOA had been illegally misusing community funds. Money collected from homeowners was being funneled into their own personal expenses under the guise of maintenance fees. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room, turning what was once a mere conflict into a full-blown financial scandal. By the time the hearing ended, the HOA was in shambles. The board members who hadn't already been arrested were now facing lawsuits, state investigations, and the collective fury of an entire neighborhood. Within days, emergency meetings were held, votes were cast, and the HOA, as it had existed for years, was officially dissolved. The homeowners, finally free from the oppressive rule of corrupt leadership, formed a new association, one that actually worked for the community instead of against it. And as for me, my property remained untouched, my backyard fully restored, my peace finally reclaimed. It had been a long, brutal fight, but in the end, justice prevailed. The HOA had tried to strip me of my rights, to turn my land into their personal parking lot, but they had failed spectacularly. They had underestimated me, thinking I would back down like so many before me. But I had stood my ground, fought back, and won. As I sat on my lakeside deck, watching the sunset without a single unwanted car in sight, I knew one thing for certain. This was my home, and no one would ever take it from me again. Epilogue: A new beginning. In the days that followed, the remnants of the old HOA collapsed like a house of cards caught in a storm. The final board members who hadn't already been arrested resigned in disgrace, their desperate attempts to salvage their reputations crushed under the weight of their own corruption. Homeowners, once too afraid to question their authority, now moved swiftly to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Legal documents were filed to officially dissolve the old HOA, and a new community-led organization was formed, one with transparency, fairness, and actual homeowner input at its core. The damage the previous regime had inflicted wouldn't be erased overnight. Years of arbitrary fines, mismanaged funds, and bullying had left deep scars. But for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt lighter, free from the oppressive rule of unchecked power. As for me, I had no intention of lingering in the aftermath longer than necessary. My fight had never been about power or control. It had been about standing up against those who thought they were untouchable, those who thrived on fear and intimidation. Now that they had been dismantled, I was content to return to the life I had built before they tried to take it from me. My backyard, once trampled by their arrogance, had been restored. The fence they had destroyed was rebuilt, stronger than before, and the security cameras I had installed now covered every inch of my property. There would be no second chances for anyone foolish enough to try what they had done. My land was mine again, not just in name, but as an absolute, undeniable fact. Still, the remnants of the battle lingered in unexpected ways. Neighbors who had once been distant now treated me with a newfound respect, some even stopping by to thank me for taking on a fight they had been too scared to start themselves. I wasn't looking for recognition, but I understood their relief. They had been living under the same suffocating grip, quietly suffering through the same abuses, and now that burden had finally been lifted. For many of them, it was the first time they felt like they could breathe in their own homes. That alone made every exhausting battle worth it. The HOA's final death blow came in the form of a formal state audit, triggered by the widespread financial mismanagement that had come to light during the investigation. Every missing dollar, every fraudulent fee, every shady transaction they had buried under legal jargon was now being dragged into the open. Several board members faced charges, not just for vandalizing my property, but for outright embezzlement. They had wielded power like a weapon for years, but in the end, they weren't just stripped of their titles. They were left with criminal records and hefty legal consequences. It was a fitting end for people who had built their entire existence on greed and control. One evening, as I sat on my deck, watching the lake ripple under the golden hues of the setting sun, I let myself finally exhale. The war was over. The last remnants of the HOA's rule had been erased, and the peace I had once thought impossible had finally settled over my home. No more letters taped to my door, no more fake fines, no more threats disguised as official notices. Just quiet, just freedom. My backyard was mine again, not a parking lot, not a community space, not something to be dictated by a group of entitled bureaucrats. Just mine. And as I watched the last light fade over the horizon, I realized something else. This wasn't just a victory for me, it was a warning. To every corrupt HOA, to every self-important board member who thought they could trample over homeowners without consequence, to every petty tyrant who believed rules only applied when it suited them. They had thought they could take whatever they wanted, But in the end, they had learned the hard way. Some people don't just roll over and accept defeat. Some people fight back. And when they do, there's no coming back from it. Life after the HOA. Life settled into a new rhythm, one free of looming threats, petty fines, and the ever-present dread of dealing with an overreaching HOA. The silence that had once felt uneasy now carried a sense of well-earned peace. There were no more unwanted notices taped to my door, no more unauthorized cars clogging up my backyard, no more fabricated rules meant to control what was never theirs to begin with. My land, my home, my space, all of it was finally, unquestionably mine. Yet, despite the victory, remnants of the battle still lingered in the form of ongoing legal proceedings, slow-moving bureaucratic processes that ensured the former board members faced the full consequences of their actions. I watched from a distance as they scrambled to defend themselves in court, their arrogance shattered, their carefully curated facade of power and authority reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale. Some managed plea deals, others were hit with fines they could never afford, and at least 2 of them faced jail time for their financial crimes. The neighborhood underwent its own transformation in the wake of their downfall. Without the constant threat of fines and surveillance, homeowners began reclaiming their properties in ways they never could before. Yards were no longer meticulously micromanaged to fit arbitrary HOA standards. Decorations and personal touches appeared on houses that had once been forced into uniformity. And for the first time in years, the community actually felt like a place where people lived, not just a collection of houses governed by an iron-fisted committee. The fear that had ruled for so long was gone, replaced by something far stronger: ownership. True ownership. People weren't just living in these homes. They were finally allowed to make them their own. Even with the dust settling, I made sure to remain vigilant. My security cameras stayed up, my legal documents remained on hand, and every new update from my lawyer ensured that there was no possible loophole left for the old HOA to exploit. Some of the former board members had disappeared entirely, too humiliated to show their faces after their public disgrace. Others still clung to the last scraps of their former influence, attempting to play the victims of a system they had once abused so freely. But no one in the neighborhood was fooled. They had ruled through intimidation for years, but their time was over. And the people they had once controlled had no sympathy left for them. The community had moved on, and so had I. One afternoon, as I stood in my backyard, looking over the pristine lake that had once been the center of so much conflict, I let myself finally relax. The battle was over. The scars of what had happened remained, but they no longer defined my home. The grass had grown back where tire tracks once cut deep. The fence had been rebuilt, and the quiet hum of the water lapping against the shore carried no trace of the war that had been fought here. It was a reminder of what had been taken, but more importantly, of what had been reclaimed. This was my land, my sanctuary, my home, and no one, not an HOA, not a board of power-hungry officials, not a single person who had tried to strip me of what was mine, could ever take it from me again. As I turned back toward my house, the evening breeze cooling the last remnants of the day's warmth, I realized that this victory wasn't just about me. It was a lesson, a warning, a testament to the power of standing up when no one else will. The HOA had tried to turn my backyard into their own personal parking lot, assuming I would cave, assuming I would let them rewrite the rules as they saw fit. But they had underestimated me, just as they had underestimated the strength of those they had oppressed for years. In the end, they hadn't just lost their power, they had lost everything. I had fought back, and I had won. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.